The ice does not forgive. It does not negotiate. It simply waits, silent and patient, for anything warm to surrender its heat to the void. 23,000 years ago, during the peak of the last glacial maximum, the Northern Hemisphere was a kingdom of frost that stretched from Siberia to what would one day be called Canada. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius for months at a time. Winds carved the tundra into frozen waves. Blizzards erased entire valleys overnight. And in this world where survival meant constant movement or certain death, something massive walked alone through the white silence. They were giants, not the creatures of myth or legend, but biological anomalies, beings that stood 4 to 5 meters tall, weighing close to 800 kilograms, with bodies built like living fortresses against the cold. Their bones were dense, their muscles layered thick beneath skin that had evolved over millennia to trap heat like stone retains warmth from a fire long extinguished. They had no tools, no clothing, no shelters carved from wood or hide, no controlled fire to gather around when the long polar nights stretched for weeks without end. They had only themselves, and a physiology so extreme that modern science would struggle to explain how it functioned. These were not hunters. They were not warriors. They were survivors in the purest sense, shaped by an environment that killed almost everything else. The landscape they inhabited was a contradiction, beautiful in its desolation, deadly in its simplicity. Glaciers crept across the earth like slow rivers of stone, grinding mountains into dust. Permafrost locked the ground solid to depths of 30 meters or more. Trees were rare, stunted, clinging to sheltered valleys where the wind could not reach. What grew instead were lichens, mosses, low grasses that turned brown and brittle under endless frost. The sun, when it appeared, hung low and pale, offering light but almost no warmth. The moon was often brighter, and through this world, the giants moved. They walked in patterns, not random wandering, but deliberate routes carved into their biology over thousands of generations. They followed the ridges where the wind cleared away the deepest snow. They avoided the valleys where cold air pooled and settled like invisible poison. They knew, without language or maps, where meltwater might still flow beneath the ice in summer, where caves opened into hillsides, where the permafrost cracked just enough to expose frozen roots that could be chewed for moisture and calories. Their footsteps were deep. Each one sank into snow and frozen mud with the weight of a falling boulder. When spring came and the ice briefly softened, those prints would fill with meltwater, then freeze again into permanent scars on the land. Some of those prints have been found, fossilized, preserved under layers of sediment and glacial till, enormous depressions that no known animal from that era could have made. Dismissed by some as natural formations, studied in silence by others who cannot explain them. The giants did not hunt in the way wolves or humans did. Their size made stealth impossible. Their caloric needs were staggering, perhaps 15,000 calories per day, just to maintain core temperature in sub-zero cold. But they were not carnivores. Their teeth, when fragments have been recovered, show wear patterns consistent with grinding plant material, tough fibers, frozen roots. They fed on what the Ice Age tundra offered: sedges, wild grasses, bark stripped from the few surviving trees, the occasional carcass of a mammoth or woolly rhino already dead from cold or predation. They did not compete with the great predators of the Ice Age: cave lions, short-faced bears, packs of dire wolves. All of these avoided the giants, not out of fear, but out of indifference. There was no benefit in attacking something so large, so resilient, that moved without aggression and offered no easy meat. The giants were not part of the food chain. They existed parallel to it, occupying a niche that required nothing more than endurance. But endurance in -40 degrees is not a passive act. It is a biological war fought every second. Their metabolism was unlike anything alive today. Slow when at rest, explosive when needed. They could lower their heart rate to conserve energy during the worst storms, entering a state that resembled partial hibernation. Not true sleep, but a deep stillness where breathing slowed, body temperature dropped slightly, and consciousness dimmed to a flicker. They would stand in place, sometimes for days, buried under drifting snow, until the wind stopped and the cold eased just enough to move again. When they did move, heat flooded their bodies. Massive muscles generated warmth through motion. Blood thickened with natural antifreeze compounds circulated slowly, preventing ice crystals from forming in tissue. Fat reserves, stored in layers across their torso and limbs, insulated vital organs and provided emergency fuel when food was impossible to find. Their skin was thick, almost leathery, with a network of blood vessels that could constrict to trap heat or dilate to release it when exertion caused dangerous overheating. They did not sweat. Water loss in that climate meant death. Instead, they regulated temperature through breathing. Long, controlled exhalations that released moisture as fine mist into the frozen air. Shelter was rare but essential. The giants sought out caves, overhangs, spaces where rock absorbed what little warmth the earth still held and radiated it back slowly through the night. They did not build. They did not modify their environment. They simply found what already existed and occupied it until the season changed. Inside these spaces, evidence remains. Scratches on stone walls where massive hands braced against cold rock, compressed layers of organic material, plant fibers, animal hair, their own shed skin, that formed insulating beds over years of repeated use. Some caves show signs of something stranger, arrangements of stones, not random collapses, but deliberate placements. Heavy rocks moved to block wind, smaller stones stacked to create barriers between sleeping areas and the open mouth of the cave. Whether this was instinct or intelligence, no one can say, but it was purposeful. They were not entirely alone. Humans existed in that world, though in far smaller numbers and far from the frozen northern reaches where the giants lived. When the two species encountered each other, and they must have, at least occasionally, there was no conflict. Humans were too fragile to threaten a giant. Giants were too indifferent to bother with humans. The interactions, if they happened, would have been brief, a moment of mutual observation across a frozen plain. Eyes meeting, then turning away, each returning to their own struggle for survival. But humans remembered. In caves far to the south, where Ice Age hunters sheltered during winter, there are paintings, figures. Enormous humanoid shapes rendered in ochre and charcoal on stone walls. Taller than any human. Alone. Walking. Standing. No weapons. No context. Just presence. Archaeologists have called them symbolic, mythological, artistic exaggeration. But they are always the same proportions. Always isolated. Always facing away. As if walking into a distance the artist could not follow. The giants left no art, no burials, no structures, only their bones, scattered and rare, and the ghost of their passage preserved in stone. As the Ice Age began to end, the world shifted. Temperatures rose, glaciers retreated. The tundra gave way to forests, grasslands, wetlands, Animals that thrived in the cold, mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant sloths, began to disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, over centuries. The giants, too, faded. Their food sources changed. Their migration routes were disrupted. The caves they relied on flooded or collapsed as permafrost melted, and the land itself transformed. They were built for a world that no longer existed. There are no records of their final days. No last stand, no great catastrophe. Just absence. Fewer sightings, fewer tracks, until there were none. By 10,000 years ago, they were gone. Whether they died out completely or retreated into the deepest, coldest places that remained, high mountains, polar wastes, no one knows. If any survived into the Holocene, they left no trace. But the questions remain. Fossilized footprints too large to explain. Bones that do not match any known species. Cave art that refuses to be dismissed as imagination. And the simplest, most haunting mystery of all. How did something that massive, that dependent on extreme cold, endure for so long in an environment that should have killed it in weeks? The Ice Age was not a brief event. It lasted for millennia. To survive even one winter at -40 degrees without fire or shelter requires adaptations that push the limits of biology. To survive thousands of winters across generations implies something extraordinary. Something we have not yet understood. Perhaps the giants were an evolutionary dead end, a biological experiment that worked only in the most extreme conditions. Perhaps they were something older, a remnant from an earlier epoch when the Earth was colder still, clinging to existence until the world warmed beyond their tolerance. Or perhaps they were simply what they appeared to be. Creatures of ice and stone and silence, designed by time and environment to endure the unendurable and forgotten because they left nothing behind but footprints, frozen in time. The cold does not remember them. The ice has melted. The tundra has turned green. But somewhere, buried under sediment or locked in glaciers that have not yet melted, there may still be answers. Bones, tissue, DNA, evidence of how they lived, how they survived, and why they vanished. Until then, they remain what they have always been. Ghosts of the Ice Age, walking through a world too harsh for memory, too cold for history, and too silent to ever speak their name.